the native plant garden, and our members are Joan Zatlukel, Judy Moyer, Jennifer Johnson, Lynn and John Skidmore, Carol Schellenberger, and new members Chris Conacher and Lucy Shaw. So they have been helpful in so many ways and hard workers. And today we dedicate our garden as the Ed LaCrosse Native Garden. The need for a native plant garden sprang forth in 2018. Chloracy cottages were to be torn down that fall and our community garden cleared. What could we do with our beloved natives? I'm a native plant steward and a wet and wild wetland steward, and our extra lot in Kent was a native plant haven and a backyard wildlife habitat. And we had moved a number of those hard-to-get precious plants and shrubs to Old Cottage 50 and my native plot in the community garden. And Judy had a number of natives around her cottage also. I talked with Christine Tremaine about it, and she was very encouraging and suggested getting a group of supporters and including their names in a letter to Kevin Anderson and Alex. And Joan was the chair of the Garden Side Gardens, and she had me talk to the gardeners' potluck, and they voted for it. And then she talked to people at the terrace and found Ed LaCrosse, a native plant steward who was eager to join us, and his buddy Frank Needles. And I thought Frank and Roberta would be here. But anyway, away we went. And then Kevin approved of the garden. And so we had our first meeting April 18th, 2018, on Earth Month at least. So that was the start. And Ed was only 90 in 2018, but he didn't behave like 90. He was an enthusiastic, can-do worker. And later on, Judy and I were busy digging and potting natives to bring here, and Ed and Frank were moving them. Ed decided we should also move our 15-foot mock orange. This is my favorite tale about Ed. It shows his spirit. I thought it was much too big. Ed knew we could do it. I hired Kingsley, a sturdy young refugee staying at the gardens, to help. And this was July or August, so it was hot. Ed, Frank, and Kingsley started early in the cool next morning. They shoveled, pried, and pulled, wrestling with the roots until they were exhausted. I was pretty concerned. I was afraid somebody was going to have a heart attack when they finally left for lunch. And I called my son David, who was another can-do guy with a lot of tools. He came with his pickup and fixed a chain around the mock orange and pulled, and it mocked him. He unhooked and attached a rope and pulled, and again failed. He didn't want to tear it up. It was part of the problem. Unhooking again, rather frustrated, he wrapped a long fire hose remnant carefully kind of through and around it and slowly pulled again. It finally came free without being torn apart. We loaded it quickly and were hauling it here where the Skidmores had dug a hole just as Ed, Ralph, and Kingsley returned. As Ed was helping kind of stomp in the dirt around the roots, he exclaimed, "See, I knew we could do it." Our sons brought my mason bee box and a part of our deck railing here during the move. Shortly thereafter, Ed, probably with Frank's help, had dug holes for the posts, leveled and set it in cement, and the mason bee box was on a 4x4 post dug in. He did heavy labor. Soon after, he had our native plant list fixed to the railing and plant labels in front of each plant. He was getting us organized. This was in addition to work parties clearing the ivy, holly, and Japanese knotweed, digging and replanting from pots, trips to the UW native plant sales, working at the Meeker homestead, running the Terrace used furniture store with Frank, and I believe that year he also served as the Terrace resident council chair. He was a mild-mannered, I'm making up the word maybe, non-Garian, Superman in disguise. So in very loving and thankful memory of this remarkable man, we are dedicating our garden as the Ed LaCrosse Native Garden. And that lovely sign you see there was sponsored by Lynn and John Skidmore and created by Bob and Joyce Stratton. So thank you, Skidmores and Strattons. And now we'll have a few words from Lynn, and then Anna Marie is going to share more about her father. Then we can have coffee and cookies and check out the garden, but do it very carefully. It's very uneven. So here's Lynn.
I have to say I was fascinated to discover that he was 90 in 2018 because I met him in 2008. So he happened to be a very agile 80 years old when I met him. And he was the hardest working guy at the Neely Soames Homestead Heritage Garden, where I started to volunteer. And I didn't have any idea that I was going to become a master gardener, but based on his lovely example and his and the great devoted people who were the volunteers there, and we all loved him. What can you say? I mean, he was kind and enthusiastic, encouraging, and very, very, very polite man. I mean, he was always concerned about you. When you talked to Ed, you knew you had his full attention, which was, he was a remarkable human being. But he eventually became my mentor, and he wrote me what I understand was a sterling recommendation to join the Master Gardener program, which is one way to get into it. You had to have a history of volunteering in order to get into the program, and he sent me right to the moon. Let's put it that way. So he was a remarkable human being, and I was very honored to be part of one of his proteges at the garden. And he worked there until about 2 years, I think, after he moved here, and he was probably about 2017. A modernization came in, and it was a problem. So for the master gardeners, you had to log into your hours on the computer, and he wasn't really going to do that. So it's actually a whole bunch of master gardeners just exited stage left when that happened. So meanwhile, we were, and my husband also worked with Ed in the garden, and he became a master gardener 2 years after I did, and he also was sponsored by Ed as in his recommendation. So anyway, we felt really lucky to have known him.
Would you like to put it on that tent?
Can everybody hear me if this is in the folder?
No.
Okay. I am just really honored to be here today and share a piece of my dad with you all, and to see that this garden and his fruits of labor are going to be cherished and live on. Dad wasn't always a gardener. It wasn't till after he retired from a 40-year career in education that he signed up for the Master Gardener Training Program through WSU. When he returned from the Navy after World War II, he pursued getting his high school diploma because he had dropped out to join the war, attended Olympic College, got married, then got his bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, and continued on to earn his master's degree in education from Western Washington University. He was principal at Rainier State School in Buckley for the disabled when he was offered and recommended to receive a fellowship grant to earn his doctorate in special education from Columbia University in New York City. So we moved to the East Coast. And although I remember, in spite of him being very busy as a college professor, a national special education consultant traveling all over the country, directors of programs for children with special needs, he wrote books on teacher training for the retarded, and he was on the board of directors for many organizations serving the needs of families and children with disabilities. He would always come home in the evenings and the weekends and putter in the yard. He was always from Seattle to New Jersey to Southern California to Nebraska and back to Seattle. He was always created these beautiful landscapes in our yards, including everything from patios, planting trees, bushes, flowers, building waterfalls, fountains, statuaries, to built-in barbecue pits. For my high school graduation, he had built a brick and stone barbecue pit to roast a suckling pig for my high school luau. And then my mom was always finding new and unusual things for him to incorporate into his yard, like a 12-foot paper Japanese umbrella, which he built a gazebo for it to be housed in, a 200-pound lava rock, which he incorporated into a waterfall, and a 300-pound Buddha fountain concrete, which my daughter is in the process of moving to her next new house. But he always left our backyards much more beautiful than when we moved in. But I suppose he came by gardening rightfully, because I remember my grandfather had several acres in Puyallup, where my dad had grown up. And there he grew raspberries, fruit trees, roses, and vegetables. And I remember seeing the biggest zucchini in my life. It was just huge. It had to be that big. Anyway, after retiring in 1990, he signed up for the Master Gardener training course. I was so impressed. He was learning Latin words for plants and trees at his age. He would go on walks and he'd go, oh, there's Mahonia, there's Pachysandra, there's, there's Indian plum. And I was just amazed. I could hardly remember, that's a dandelion. And he volunteered at the King County Clinic in Kent. And then he became president of the King County Master Gardener Foundation and helped organize and run their spring plant sale. He was instrumental in getting his granddaughter's Girl Scout and campfire groups involved in the restoration and planting of native plants for salmon habitat at the Des Moines Creek Park and at the Tyee Golf Course, and out in Enumclaw at the new Wahican Creek. They were planting plants and learning to become good stewards of the land. My youngest daughter to this day is so impressed that she can say Holodiscus discolori and knows what it means. And our other daughter is following in his footsteps in becoming an avid gardener with vegetables in her yard. He also became a native plant steward for the Northwest Native Plant Society and developed a training presentation on gardening with native plants, which he presented at garden clubs, lecture series, flower societies, women's clubs, libraries, and youth groups. He was chairman of the native plant section at the Master Gardener annual sale and a member of the King County Master Gardener Speakers Bureau. But going back to what Lynn was saying about technology, his was a slide presentation. It took him a while to get it turned into a PowerPoint. So, yeah. In 1998, he became the volunteer coordinator for the Neely Soames Historical Homestead, a heritage demonstration garden in Kent. He developed coalitions between the garden, the community, including scout troops and local businesses, to help with the upkeep of the garden, like painting fences, building the grape and hops trellises, and weeding all the way to harvesting the crops to be delivered to the local food banks. He worked closely with the City of Kent Parks Department and the Master Gardener Foundation to garner funding and resources to maintain and expand the gardens. He had upward of 25 volunteers and more than 500 hours of volunteer time each year. He also initiated the horticultural classes presented there to provide educational opportunities to visitors to the garden and beyond. He received recognition from the mayor and the City of Kent for his dedication of nearly 20 years of service to the Neely Soames homestead and the Historic Heritage Demonstration Gardener. He became president of the board for the Washington State Master Gardener Foundation in 1999 and served through 2006. He also served as historian for the state foundation, and he organized a biennial legislative day for master gardeners to meet with and educate their state legislators. And he was instrumental in organizing numerous statewide annual advanced training conferences. He received the Master Gardener State Service Award in 2006, and in 2008 that award was renamed the Ed LaCrosse Service Award in recognition of his commitment, involvement, and service, and is still named that today. In 2010, he was designated as the Washington State Master Gardener of the Year. He inspired gardeners, mentored, educated community members, and nurtured flourishing plants, gardeners, and gardens. In addition to his official garden duties, he was also ready to help family and friends with their yard and garden projects. He'd trim hedges, pull weeds, and was always willing to share cuttings or offshoots of his amazing plants. My garden and yard is living testimony to that. And yes, my husband. He became involved in this garden at its inception at the ripe age of 90, and he was still going strong. He made a couple trips to the annual garden sale to procure items on the list to be planted here, and most of them seemed to be doing well. So whether he was a teacher, a gardener, or a parent, he demonstrated the kind, helpful, and nourishing nature needed to make things grow and thrive. May his garden thrive and bloom for a long time, and his loving, living legacy to Ed LaCrosse. In closing, I'd like to share a personal experience. Dad had requested many years ago that he wanted to hear Bette Midler's song, Wind Beneath My Wings, at his funeral service. And so I always imagined my dad soaring with eagles, and that's what we were going to do. Well, after his passing last August, we were sitting in my backyard making plans for his service, talking about that song, and this little honeybee landed on my arm, and he just sat there. And the kids were going, "Mom, there's a bee on your arm." And he just sat there. He was so nice and calm. And then flew away. And he came back a couple seconds later and landed on my hand. He just sat there. He flew away and came back a third time. And I realized that bees have wings and wind beneath their wings. And this must be Dad's soul spirit. He's a honeybee. Bees are the life of the garden. Without bees, there are no flowers, trees, no food, no beautiful gardens. This garden also has a home for bees. So when you see one of them, say hi and think of Ed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna Marie. What a man. I mean, we know so little of our neighbors, and they can be so inspiring, unbelievable, really. So thank you so much for coming, and we have coffee and tea and cookies, and please check the garden out, but do it very carefully because it's quite uneven. And thank you so much for coming.